Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining this joint webinar between IRENA and the FAO on scaling up renewables use in agriculture in Asia towards the 2030 agenda and climate goals. We are very pleased to organize this virtual side event during the ADB Asia Clean Energy Forum, which is happening between the 14th and the 17th of June. So we do have a packed agenda ahead of us. We'll be beginning with a round of opening remarks, one from IRENA, one from FAO, and a short scene setting presentations. And we'll then jump right into a moderated panel discussion with audience Q&A. As you can see, we have an excellent lineup of speakers and a moderator who bring rich experience from the ground in terms of what is needed to scale up renewables use in agriculture. And it does assure to be quite a candid conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on the floor to Dr. Ute Collier, who's the Deputy Director of the Knowledge Policy and Finance Center at IRENA, for her opening remarks. Ute, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Divyam. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Abu Dhabi. On behalf of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, I'm pleased to welcome you to this joint side event with FAO. We'll have some remarks from my colleague Zitouni from the FAO in a moment as well. As you probably know, one of the themes of this year's ACEF is cross-sectoral applications for inclusive energy and inclusive energy transition. This is a very relevant focus, given that it's more and more recognized that you have to look at the energy transition holistically. And energy agriculture is one of the important linkages that have been highlighted. And of course, these linkages directly or indirectly touch on every aspect of society, economy, and the environment. I'm sure all of you realize that energy is required at each stage of the agri-food value chain, whether it's for primary production or processing, storage, transport, retailing, but also cooking. And in many developing countries, including in Asia, we do have a lack of access, either total absence of energy or lack of access to reliable energy.
Oops, did we lose? Ute, can you hear us? I think we're facing some technical challenges there. Perhaps, Zitouni, we could...
No, I'm back. I don't know what happened. Sorry about this. Suddenly, this went on the other screen. Can you see me now?
We can't see you, but we can hear you loud and clear. And now we can see you. Perfect.
Okay. What did you actually hear? Did my remarks totally disappear?
No, we heard about the importance of addressing the energy agriculture linkages.
Thank you. Okay. You know, I'm just unplugging my other.
Oops, I think we're still facing some technical issues. While we resolve that, perhaps Zitouni, we could listen to your opening remarks and then go back to Ute once the technical issues are sorted. Apologies for that.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to. I wonder if you want to give her one more chance just in case. Otherwise, I'm happy to start.
I think on the back, our tech team was probably trying to figure it out with Ute, so perhaps we can move here.
Okay, well, thank you very much and welcome everyone to this event. It's really a pleasure to speak at this event, just to put it in context and also to highlight, you know, the great working relationship that we have been developing with IRENA. This has started when we both recognized the importance of linking up energy security to food security. And as part of that, we formalized that to a memorandum of understanding that allows us to set out what is it that we want to develop together going forward. And I'm pleased that at the last COP26, we were able to do a joint report that actually spells out, the opportunities for renewable energy in the agri-food systems. And from there, we saw really the potential of looking at helping countries and farmers and other organizations as well to benefit from renewable energy as an accelerator, really, to help us to transform the agri-food systems. Our vision is to have agri-food systems that are efficient, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient to impacts of crises such as climate change, biodiversity loss, but also crises such as the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And I think in this time where we are looking for solutions to be scaled up, to speed up our response to climate change and energy security and food security, linking up renewable energy and agriculture makes a lot of sense from an environmental perspective, but also economic perspective and social perspective. Because this linkages has so many co-benefits. So it's not only to help us really tackle the increasing problem of climate change, but also to help other communities, particularly in rural areas, to access energy, sustainable energy, renewable energy that can be used in farming to help access water, to help store food, and also to help with sustainability in the farm and beyond the farm in general, beyond the farm, because of the importance of cooling as well of food. And there is one area in particular where we see big potential with IRENA and in also achieving the multiple benefits that I mentioned, and that's particularly the linkages between energy, food, and water. And this is particularly pertinent in the current context, but also in the international dimension, given the next COP27 on climate change. This will be an African COP in Cairo, where these three dimensions are critical: water, energy, and food. And also at COP 28 in UAE, where the Middle East and the Arab region community in general also gives a big importance to these areas. So you will hear from my colleague Irene, who will talk about experiences with countries, particularly India and Uzbekistan. And I think it's important that we show also how this is being applied in the field, in countries, and what are the lessons learned in terms of synergies and trade-offs as well. So this is really the point I want to make to set the scene, and just to stress how pleased we are with the collaboration with IRENA. And I really look forward to strengthening this relationship, because we have a lot to work on together and to offer together in this space. So welcome again, everyone. Really a pleasure to introduce this event. I hope you will enjoy it and participate, so we can get your feedback and your thoughts as well, to help IRENA and FAO and other key partners to go forward. My colleague Olivier will moderate the panel, and there's a big focus on investment. That's another really important area, but that's something that will be really good again to hear your thought on that, because when we did the report for COP26 last year, we had that in mind of, what do we need to do on the ground, and the fact that it requires financial support to be able to create projects with IRENA and others on the ground. So thank you again, Divwam and Ute and colleagues from IRENA. And we really look forward to the follow-up of this event and more to do in this space with you. Thank you, and back to you.
Thanks so much, Zitouni. I see Ute is back online. Perhaps, Ute, can you hear us loud and clear?
Yes, thank you, Divya. It's great. We're back in the office 100% today here in Abu Dhabi, and it seems our system can't cope. So I had the blue screen of death, which I haven't seen for a long time. So unfortunately, I didn't hear everything Zitouni said, but I mean, just from our perspective, obviously we worked with FAO on the joint report, which we launched at COP. There were a lot of areas in that work. Well, we highlighted the positive developments, and there are many of them, but also many areas of where there is further effort needed, especially on the enabling policy framework, on financing, technology and innovation. So from our perspective, we want to use this event as a kind of next step, convening practitioners and stakeholders to further discuss the lessons. And we're particularly pleased to launch a report, well, a short brief as well, on renewable energy for agriculture in Southeast Asia with a focus on heating and cooling needs. People tend to forget how important heating and cooling really is. I mean, across all sectors, but specifically also in agriculture. It's not just about access to electricity. It's also a need for heating and cooling, for drying, for cooling agricultural produce to ensure you extend its life, reduce waste, etc. So we've brought together a number of case studies, and my colleague Divya will give you some of those. And then we have a great lineup of panelists who've been deeply involved in designing and running these kind of energy agriculture programs in Asia. So I really look forward to listening to that. And with that, I'll hand back to my colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks, Ute. So as Ute mentioned, we are launching a short brief looking specifically at renewable energy for agriculture in Southeast Asia, with some examples of how they can be used to meet heating cooling needs. What I'll do is I'll give a very short sort of brief overview of the report itself, the case studies it covers, and then hand over to my FAO colleague Irene for her scene setting presentation. So very briefly, as we understand and recognize quite well, is that agriculture sector, as much in the developing world, in Southeast Asia too, plays quite an important role within. And if you look at the GDP, agriculture contributes about 10.5% of GDP in the region. Agriculture is also an important source of exports, so it accounts for about 10% of total regional exports. This is from 2020, and this figure varies quite significantly, where in countries like Laos, the Philippines, and Myanmar, where the share is much higher. And also, the agriculture sector is an important employer. So in almost 7 out of 10 countries in the region, greater than 25% of total employment is through agriculture. So meeting the sustainable development goals, meeting the socioeconomic development objectives will need to have agriculture and its growth and development at the center of the ecosystem. Now that requires many things. One of the key infrastructure inputs is, of course, energy use. At the production stage alone, the agriculture sector accounted for about 2% of the region's total final energy consumption in 2019. Much of that comes from fossil fuel based sources through oil and oil products, some electricity, biomass as well. And as we see as a trend across the region in Asia, the energy consumption in this stage will continue to grow, and it has grown quite significantly in the past decade. Now, beyond the production or beyond the farm gate, energy use is also growing, and in fact growing to become a much more significant share in the overall energy use in the sector. In the Philippines alone, almost greater than 25% of the energy use in industry goes into food-related sectors. Similarly, we see in Thailand, where a great deal of process heat in the agriculture and sugar, pulp, paper sectors comes through through residues and waste sources. So what we're also seeing is that to meet those energy needs, increasingly renewable energy options are available and are being increasingly deployed. As Ute mentioned in her remarks, usually the focus tends to be primarily on delivering electricity as the service and not so much as the heating cooling side, which again is quite an important service to be delivered, whether it's for storage, whether it's for post-harvest processing, or later on for cooking purposes, for instance. So what we try to do in this particular report is try and bring together some smaller examples from the region, and as well as some of the larger programs which have addressed heating and cooling as part of a broader portfolio of solutions to deploy renewables in the sector. I won't get into the details, but some of the programs that we looked at, one of them, of course, from Cambodia, which has had the Clean Energy Revolving Fund, which essentially provided loans anywhere between $7,000 to $50,000 without traditional collaterals for farmers and agri enterprises to be able to access renewable energy systems to reduce their energy costs and become more competitive, but also to improve water access and for other purposes on farm, as well as for processing, as well as for as well as the biogas powered agricultural processing initiative, which was in the country. The revolving fund itself covered about 50 odd projects, but provided important insights on how the financing needs to be tailored to deploy renewables in the agriculture sector, and particularly how to make it acceptable or make it accessible for farmers and agri enterprises. And there's important learnings in the vegetable and the spices, fruits, but also in the pig farm value chain. We also looked at Indonesia, looking at the Simba Island initiative, which of course included a portfolio of solutions, among them also biogas as part of the broader Indonesian domestic biogas program, which deployed greater than about 25,000 household biogas systems through collaborations between different stakeholders. So again, important lessons emerging there, especially on cooperation with utilities, with local governments, but also with corporates like Nestle and others, as well as intermediary banks to deliver the financing for communities. And we also looked at an interesting case from the Philippines on the integration of productive uses of renewable energy for inclusive and sustainable energization, or the IPO project, which is being implemented by the Mindanao Development Authority. And I'm very pleased to have the Deputy Executive Secretary here who will speak during the panel. And which, of course, is Mindanao, for those who may not be aware, is one of 3 regions in the Philippines, and a food basket, also considered as a food basket, accounting for almost greater than 40% of the country's food production, including for exports. And there, the particular program focused on deploying renewables for agro-fishery processing facilities, for solar drying for seaweed, coffee, as well as for ice making in the fishery sector. And finally, and a well-known program, also glad to have Wim from SNV here on the biogas program in Vietnam, which has deployed, I think, over 290,000 digesters through the main program, as well as spillovers, impacting about 1.7 million people. And lots of interesting lessons also emerging from that program, both in terms of impact, but also on how to design a sustainable market with local enterprises and training to deliver these solutions. Across each of these cases and the smaller ones that we analyzed in the report, we found a number of impacts that cut across, the economic impacts, social impacts, and environmental impacts, and a lot of anecdotal evidence of how how renewables can reduce farming and processing costs, increase incomes from value addition, reduce losses, but also create jobs in the process. On the environment side, of course, reduce emissions and indoor pollution, but also tackle waste management and the great deal of residue that is generated from the agri sector in the region. And importantly, on how crucial it is to improve resilience to external shocks in the sector and the impact it has on food security. This in addition to, of course, the social impacts around time savings and gender equality and reduced premature deaths. So just to end, to say that there are a couple of areas where we thought some action is needed. One is to scale up renewables, since there are several challenges. One is, of course, to look at follow a value chain approach to see where renewable energy opportunities fit in. By just focusing on one part of the value chain or one solution, one tends to miss out, of course, the stakeholders, but also the broader ecosystem elements that need to be in place to achieve the viability of those interventions itself. So if you don't have market access, if you don't have skills further down the supply chain, then the intervention upwards of the supply chain is not very viable and impacts are limited. Develop targets, strategies, and measures for heating cooling applications. We've seen some countries in the region integrate within their NDCs targets for renewables-based heating cooling, particularly around biodigesters. Those need to be scaled up. In the Philippines, we've seen a dedicated policy between the Department of Agriculture and Energy to work together to scale up, cross renewables in the sector. So we need to see more of that. Financing remains a key problem, and this will be addressed in the discussion, I'm sure, around how do we exactly tailor the financing products for end users, but also enterprises and ecosystem actors. How do we strengthen cross-sector planning and partnerships for sustainability? So it's not just about deploying renewables, it's about looking at what makes sense and how do we ensure that the water, energy, food nexus, sustainability considerations are accounted for rather than just pushing a certain technology. How do we invest in technology innovation and piloting and support that process in creating energy efficient milling machines or processing equipment? And finally, emphasize inclusivity in program design and implementation. So how do we engage local enterprises, the youth, the gender in an inclusive manner to maximize the impact? So I'll pause here. The report, just a brief snapshot of all of IRENA's work on agri-food chains, and which we've been doing with a number of partners, including the FAO. So I'll pause here, and the report is now online on IRENA website, and we look forward to hearing any feedback and on the report itself. And with that, now I pass on the floor to my colleague IRENA from FAO for her presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so very much following on from the discussion, the first part of the scene setting presentation and some of the key points that were made. So just to position agriculture within a context, it's very important to recall that agriculture, on the one hand, contributes to climate change, on the other hand, is impacted by climate change, but very importantly, to focus on the fact that it is part of the solution. As we've been saying, energy is used along all the stages of the food value chain, starting from production all the way up to energy end uses, up to food consumption. And as we know, at a global level, 30% of global energy is used within agri-food systems. So what this also leads us to understand is that it is extremely important that sustainable energy solutions are part of the strategy towards enabling agri-food systems and making them more sustainable and enabling them to meet the World Development Goals. We know still that 811 million people are undernourished in the world, and that more than half of these people are actually in Asia, up to 480 million people. So trying to channel growth through the agriculture sector is essential. In fact, 2 to 3 times, this can be 2 to 3 times more effective in raising incomes and in actually achieving poverty reduction targets. And over the recent years, what we have seen is that actually the pandemic has made this worse, adding to the general extreme weather events and economic slow downturns that we see over the period. Now, going back to a value chain approach, it is important to really focus on the whole value chain. So going from inputs, production, all the way up to consumption, and understanding how energy is used at each stage of the value chain, therefore understanding how possibly renewable energy can come in for 2 purposes. On the one hand, to actually meet possible energy gaps, which then have implications for agriculture productivity. And on the other hand, so as to diversify energy, so to move out of fossil fuels and into renewable energy. So looking at a concrete case, in terms of renewable energy for agri-food systems, and looking at the case of Uzbekistan, what we did is we looked at the agri-food chains in the country. So starting with the question, which value chains? So which value chains should we be focusing on? So we looked at which were the most important value chains in the country. Wheat is a primary value chain of the country, followed by alfalfa, horticulture, and dairy. And secondly, what role can renewable energy play in this context? And in terms of renewable energy, we see that solar energy has a very strong role to play in Uzbekistan, and we also looked at bioenergy options and wind energy. In terms of possible interventions, we analyzed 2 levels. On the one hand, what we call type 1 intervention, so much more related to equipment, so equipment that is renewable energy based. And on the second hand, electricity, where the electricity can be generated from solar energy, for example. So what we found is that in the case of wheat, it would be profitable and relevant to intervene through PV irrigation and solar mills. In the case of the horticulture chain, solar-powered cold storages to cool the produce and to store the produce. And in the case of the dairy value chain, solar-powered milk cold storages. So in terms of where to start from, because very often we get asked by countries, on the one hand, to understand which renewable energy options can make sense within their agriculture context, but also where could we start from? So start from some pilot cases, or start from some cost-effective cases, and then looking at scaling up. So the results show that the most profitable solutions would be cold milk storage for the solar and solar wheat mills. So cold milk storage for the dairy chain, both in terms of being cost effective and a larger number of units that could be deployed, and then solar wheat mills. Now, a second case instead, which is the other side of the agri-food chain and energy interlinkages, is instead looking at the case of India, where a huge amount of crop residues are burnt. In this case, the resource can be sourced from an agriculture value chain to then produce energy. So what we see in India, about 500 million tons of crop residues are generated annually across the country, so a huge volume of residues. We focus the analysis at the first step, looking at the state of Punjab. And in Punjab alone, we find that 15.4 million tons of rice straw are burnt every year. So these residues are burnt, are not currently used, and the way of disposing them and getting rid of them off the field is actually to burn them. So first of all, we mapped the residues. This is a map of Punjab to understand the location of the total amount of rice straw produced. So the darker the area, the more rice straw produced. This shows a level of concentration along the over the state and the amount of rice straw that is actually produced. Now, the crux of the matter is, though, that within a very limited time window, the time window between the rice harvest and the wheat sowing, these residues need to be removed from the field. So what would be required would be to actually harvest and bale the residue, bring it to a collection center, and then to an aggregation center. And what the country is looking at is actually then to use these residues, if they were to be collected and brought to a single aggregation center, either for the production of ethanol, for the production of compressed biogas, or for the production of pellets. So we analyzed the amounts of residues, we analyzed the different possible setups for the biomass supply chain, and then looked at how these residues could be used for these different 3 types of energy production, and where would it be profitable. And to conclude on the study, what this shows is, as we know, rice straw is a valuable resource. So instead of actually burning it and causing GHG emissions, it would be important to actually use it, especially given the large amount of volumes produced that would allow then to use part of it for soil, but then also to meet other needs. Oops. But what is critical is actually mobilizing the rice straw within the 20-day period. So the need to actually construct this biomass supply chain to get it set up and enabled, and to allow for the residues to be removed and collected. The analysis showed that pellets and CBG production is viable. Also 2G ethanol could be viable, but the investment requirements would be a lot higher. And it also shows which districts one could look at starting from as promising locations. So very much going into the detail. But the main need would be to channel investment to actually enable all of this system to take off, and the amount calculated to actually start moving 30% of the rice straw, so allowing also for soil amendment and other needs in the field, would be in the range of $309 million. So I did want to flag the amount to actually contextualize the financial needs. So in terms of concluding remarks, so agri-food systems are part of the climate change solution, and for this does require access to stable and sustainable energy solutions. And as we know, access to stable energy is not always the case in the developing countries. But what we need to do is to analyze the agriculture value chains and very much develop systems based on evidence that looks at the value chains and understands where the interventions can make sense, both from a feedstock point of view, but also from a technical and economic point of view, so that then this evidence can support decisions, can support policy discussions and policy decisions, and also so that we make sure that the investments are channeled in an effective way that can then support the development of the energy solutions for the agri-food systems. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Irene, for that presentation and those case studies. Without further ado, I hand over to Olivier to take us through the moderated panel discussion stage of this event.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting and insightful presentations. And we also have the chance to have a very experienced set of panelists who have a lot of experience in Asia and also some elsewhere, but also they come from different angles, you know, from the public sector, from the private sector, from the development NGO sector. So this will be kind of interesting, I guess, I hope. And in order to, we couldn't touch on all the topics and the challenges and solutions. So we will focus our discussions on private sector and the funding of renewable energies for food chains. So the way things will go, each panelist will be asked one question to which he or she will have like 5 minutes to reply, and then we'll have the same question for all the panelists, kind of for wrapping up the panel discussion. So our first panelist is Abhishek Mala, who is energy specialist at ICEMOD, which is the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. So Abhishek, I mean, given that the focus, the area of focus of ICEMOD is mountain areas, specifically in the context of mountain areas, which is, I mean, what are the things that would allow the private sector to be involved in investing in renewable energy for agri-food chains? And this leads to the sub-question, what kind of support is missing and would be needed to boost private sector investments in renewable energy for food chains in mountainous areas? Floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Oliver. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I just would like to start with a very quick background on ICEMOD, and thank you for that introduction. So ICEMOD is an intergovernment organization that works in Hindu Kush Himalaya that extends over 3,500 kilometers from Afghanistan in west to Myanmar in the east, and crossing Pakistan, India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. So in 2018, ICEMOD, in collaboration with UNIDO and financial support from Austrian Development Agency, established REACH, which stands for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Capability for Hindu Kush Himalaya, as a regional center of excellence on sustainable energy for all. And under this initiative, we are currently working towards various key enablers to promote renewable energy and private sector in the region. Under this, we conducted a program where we are working with different private sector enterprises in promoting renewable energy in the agriculture, different agriculture value chain. And there are a series of different technology interventions and business models that we started. So one is the most critical in our region is irrigation, because of water scarcity and reliability of water. The crop production is often not what it should be. So, and given the mountain context, we had to come with like very innovative irrigation techniques, because often irrigation in mountain terrace is quite expensive, because the size of pumps are required very high, which would consume high energy, and the capital cost will go high. So we came with like smart distribution systems and those kind of technologies. We also did some cold storage where we looked into like converting the split air con into a cold storage system, and that could also use like a a normal room of a farmer where insulation can be brought up on. And similarly, like other technologies like dehydration and vertical farming and vegetable production and other things. So as in early slide, it was also mentioned, it was quite important to understand the various energy process within the value chain, And because it requires like different types of technology, which have cost variations depending on the scale and complexity. And especially the challenge is also greater, especially in a setup like ours, where, you know, the climate risks are high, the population density is very low, the connecting infrastructures, you know, the connectivity like roads and other is very weak, and flow of finance along with the capacity and level of awareness is also very low. So we, you know, also in collaboration with IRENA, we did a study and came across that it's really important to look all of this in an ecosystem approach where multiple key enabling factors are addressed. And such an ecosystem rests on pillars of tailored policy environments, you know, access to finance, end user oriented technology solution, capacity development, and multi-stakeholder partnership. And often what we have seen with the projects that we have implemented is the private sector, they have limited resource and do not have the bandwidth to tackle all these issues. Thus, it's really important for organizations like us, other development agency and government to come together and, you know, sort of like work in a ecosystem based approach. So this is something that what we have felt is much needed support for the private sector engagement if they really want to get into, you know, this kind of service sector, which is quite complex and difficult. And you know, the other supports that we're also looking is like when we think from a private sector, it's you know, the most important criteria for the private sector is that it needs to make business sense. And you know, when they are thinking of building this necessary supply chain, there is a need of business volume that makes, you know, market acceptable profits or generates market acceptable profits. And same applies to all the local intermediaries that they can think of as a business entity, you know, implementing or trying to get this service to the area. So that's why you know, often what we have seen is, you know, the cost of delivery due to you know, like rural remoteness and low demand or, you know, low population has always been, the cost of delivery has always been high. So realistically, what we have seen is, you know, to break this barrier, there is definitely what we need is, you know, some sort of viability gap funds or, you know, subsidies or other forms of incentives to really engage the private sector in this kind of setup. So I would stop there and yeah, we'll take questions later.
Thank you, Abhishek. I take a couple of points from your intervention is that you need to have a big enough demand volume to cut costs, obviously. And, you know, one way to do it is to combine, you know, perennial crops with annual crops. So you have these needs for energies and also residues throughout the year. And that's one way, but also combining energy for food with energy for other uses, and particularly in remote places, could be like, you know, for health centers. So ways to aggregate demand is an important thing for engaging the private sector. Thank you for that. And then we move to the next speaker, who is Margarita Manzo, Investment Director from Asia Sun Funder. So in your case, Margarita, we would like to touch on one aspect which is often overlooked. We often looked at the financing of energy systems or energy devices, supply systems, but we also need to look at the demand side. And so the financing of the energy appliances. So this is a question that we would like to see from your experience, combining this financing of energy systems, but also the energy appliances. So from the supplier, but also the consumer side, and the whole interaction between these systems, you know, maybe combining the two. What's your take on this challenge from your company's experience?
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Thanks for having me today. Just briefly, like Sun Funder, we're a specialized debt fund focused on decentralized energy and climate companies. We've closed over $170 million in loans, primarily in Africa, for mostly like off-grid applications of energy, as well as like CNI solar, telco solar. And productive end use is something that we've been talking about a lot over the past few years, especially like for us looking at things like solar home systems and mini grids. But that's coming from the energy perspective. But like what Olivia is asking, it's really, but how do we actually get people to plug in more appliances and more productive equipment? I like the suggestion like previously around like really aggregation of demand. Like if you have a mini grid, we always take this kind of like siloed approach. Like energy players only look at the energy piece. Agriculture people look at the mills and the other uses like the dryers. But it actually needs to have this like interdisciplinary approach when we're funding, for example, a mini grid in a rural area. It makes sense for us as a funder of energy systems to understand what is the demand for, let's say, a mill, and then what is like beyond that, like what are the drivers to actually get people to use more of the mill, so it actually makes commercial sense for that person who owns the mill to actually bring it to that town. So I think like fundamentally, like I think the root of the problem, or not the root of the problem, but it's very fundamental to like looking at any kind of funding scheme for this energy agriculture nexus. It's really understanding like the end user and their not just ability to pay, but willingness to pay. So when you're setting up financial, let's say like lease systems, pay as you go systems, it's really understanding what are those drivers for the farmer to pay, not pay. And for us as a debt funder, like that's really what we want to see. And like we've looked at a couple of systems, for example, or a couple of companies doing water pumping. And what you learn in Myanmar is not necessarily true in Cambodia. Let's say a Myanmar farmer is only willing to look at a loan or lease structure that's good for 3 years. You go to Cambodia, that's not necessarily the case. So it's really understanding, like if you're providing a pay-as-you-go system or a lease, how long is a farmer willing to pay for that system? It's also looking at things like maintenance. Like Divyam shared that example in Cambodia with the clean energy revolving fund. I actually worked in that fund at a prior job. And things like if the water pump if there's a drought, the water level is low, the water pump isn't working. The water pump is working, but there's no water coming up, then the farmer doesn't pay. So like understanding like those types of risks is really important. Other things, for example, like maintenance, how easy, as well as like access to the payment point. Like if you're working with smallholder farmers, like do they have access to the bank, or do they have like access to mobile money that they can use to pay back any kind of loans? So like really understanding the end user and being able to kind of set up a program that meets those demands. But on the funding side as well, I think part of the reason that this sector hasn't really scaled is just a lack of willingness to take risks to go into this like agri solar, like even like agriculture and like mini hydro and things like that, where in that nexus, it's for, let's say, the MFIs and the local banks that are active in the space. It's really what can be looking at alternative security packages, like what can be used as collateral that's not necessarily a land title. At Sun Funder, we've piloted 2 new funding structures in Africa. So one with a company called Inspira Farms that does solar for cold storage. And with that funding structure, we're looking at receivables and net present value of the receivables from leases to Inspira Farms customers. We're not looking at land titles and personal guarantees. And that really helps Inspira Farms like scale their operations. That also, as you scale their operations, you can also lower costs. So you have economies of scale. So it's really looking at what else can we use as security package to kind of be willing to swallow that risk and go into that space. But it also has that, yeah.
Can you ask me to wrap up, please?
Oh, sorry. So yeah, I think just also look at maybe willingness to look at like community owned or cooperative like owned models instead of just individual farmers. And yeah, maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Margarita. I take from your very interesting intervention that we need to look at the end user, and both for the end user, the supplier of energy, but also the financing institutions, how to de-risk the whole business. And I think these are important points. And the example you gave of not using the land as collateral is a very interesting one and innovative, which really looks at the risks that farmers usually don't want to take, and rightly so. I mean, this is their lifeblood, I mean, their land. And anyway, so thank you very much for your intervention. Moving on, we move now to Romeo Montenegro, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Mindanao Development Authority in the Philippines. And we take Romeo, we take advantage that you represent a kind of a public authority to try to look at the whole issue of public funding and the issue of the challenges and opportunities of private-public partnerships in helping funding, like blending and stuff like that. But also, again, if you have anything from a public authority to highlight, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Generally, we mirror the realities we have here in the Philippines, here in the island of Mindanao, insofar as this undertaking essentially mirrors what had been pointed out earlier in the discussion in terms of challenges towards scaling up and financing. And that's why in the implementation of these projects that we are now pursuing under a integration of productive uses of renewable energy, targeting initially pilot 10 communities with a specific solar-powered post-harvest facility, either corn sheller or coffee dryer or ice-making machine or solar-powered irrigation. We're doing this at this point as business cases because these are being funded through grant funds from European Union under its Access to Sustainable Energy program. But in the design, we're looking at private sector equity to be integrated so that later on we would be able to really push for its sustainability by factoring in the commercial dimension. We have had several pitfalls of free projects being just delivered to communities and ending up seeing those projects lying idle over a course of a few months because in the first place, there was not ownership, there was not any amount of equity being put forward as well by the recipients or the communities. So this time, we'd like to look at if we ever endeavor to have this scaled up and expanded to several other areas and achieve the direction towards equity, achieve towards the direction of economies of scale that would warrant bigger commercial or better commercial viability. We have to look at this being scaled up. The good thing about what we have right now in the Philippines is that there's quite a lot of enabling policies, laws, either by Congress or by local ordinances or by our own Ministry of Energy, for instance, that make it attractive this time around for small players to put up such projects at a community level. Again, we're pursuing this in off-grid areas because the ones that are being pursued by small investors, grid-connected setups are on a different level. These ones are affirmative action, purposive, and deliberate, particularly in areas where our local distribution utilities or small power companies that find the viability or the ROI of even pursuing or considering such projects. Therefore, would have to be pursued with government coming in with a gap viability fund so that this can be pursued starting off as a missionary and then later on being scaled up as a commercially driven project. And so the economic rate of return, however, is one important dimension in terms of this intervention being scaled up. And when these business cases shall have become models by which private sector would want to come in, it can certainly create that traction from investors to pursue specific projects at a community scale. So again, we're looking at several levels of design for this project as these are being as this progressed. One that is community level supported by government, which is exactly what we're doing now, in partnership with official development assistance and international funders. Another design is small investments by farmer organizations, not necessarily individual farmer, but a community of farmers, turning into a farmers cooperative or farmers association, or enterprise projects of local government units in partnership with local private sector under a PPP, public-private sector arrangement, which is actually being done right now for a number of small community projects such as hospitals, markets. Therefore, projects such as this one that will add value to agricultural productivity to increase income opportunities of communities, for instance, or farmers, then therefore this can be a viable direction as a project as well at the local government level. But at the end of the day, we always venture towards scaling this up for bigger private sector participation so that we can achieve economies.
Thank you very much, Romeo. Very interesting. You know, just if I take off my hat of moderator and a bit of a professional hat, we did some work on renewable interventions, renewable energy financing in food chains, and purely from a financial point of view, it's often challenging because the high investment costs is deterring. So, but if you look at the other benefits, the value added for the farmer, the environmental benefits, the health aspects for some investments, the land improvement for biogas, for example, all these non-purely financial aspects, if you combine them with financial profitability, then it becomes economically profitable. But this is where the whole point of the private sector teaming with the public sector become absolutely key. And we are very grateful that you were so clear about this. And we don't have time to ask you about the kind of policies, the enabling policies. Maybe this will come up in the discussion, but maybe after the meeting you could share a bit of that by emailing through to DVM and so on, that this can be shared with the participants, because this is for me the crux of the matter, how to have the enabling environment that helps not only the financing, but financing as a key barrier often. Thank you. I'm speaking too much as a participant, as a panelist now. So going back to my role as moderator, I would like now to give the floor to Stuart Crane, who is the Managing Director of Village Infrastructure Angel. And Stuart, your organization has a lot of experience of investments in renewable energy for not only in agri-food chains, but also in other sectors. So we would like to ask you, I mean, you must have good and bad experience about, private sector funding, public sector funding. Can you let us know very honestly your experience of good points, challenges, opportunities? What's your take on these challenges and opportunities from both public and private sector funding? Floor is yours, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Olivier. And you're inviting the dragon into the den if you're asking me to be honest. I usually get in trouble for that. But I'll take the gloves off and share what I can. I've been doing rural electrification for 25 years. I started in Nepal doing microhydro mini grids. And that's quite relevant because the biggest daytime use of energy there was milling. And milling is a need. It's not a want. You can't eat unless you mill the crops. So when solar prices started falling through $1 per watt, we knew it was getting cheap enough to be able to do anything in the daytime without batteries, even heating water and things like that. So solar milling became of distinct interest. So we started doing some of the first solar mills in the world because there weren't any. There were solar water pumps for pre-harvest technology, but post-harvest, there was very little application of solar. In those intermediate years, I had experience with white LED lighting, starting with early projects in 2000, creating Barefoot Power in 2005 to replace kerosene lamps, and growing that up to a multi-million-dollar business before it was destroyed by impact investors. So I'm taking some of those older experiences and putting them into what is the apparently new opportunity of applying solar to agriculture. First with solar mills, more recently with solar cookers, dryers, washing machines, and low-cost refrigeration. We've deployed 600 solar mills with USAID Powering Agriculture, AFD, DFAT, and other support, all public money. The original intent was that we would have $1 million risk guarantee to mobilize $3 million of private sector capital. It completely failed. There was no private sector capital interested in deploying solar mills as an early stage technology to poor people in Vanuatu, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Asia Pacific area. We also had a parallel project in Honduras, Inter-American Development Bank supporting with the SWIFT through Roots of Impact, and Sun Funder participated a bit as a debt investor. And that, again, tried to mobilize private sector capital. Sun Funder was the ones who stepped up. But again, that wasn't really a success either, because Sun Funder took absolutely no risk. Apologies to my co-panelist. They asked for 108% guarantee. So we had to give them more money than we were borrowing from them. We were borrowing our own money at double-digit interest rates. This is not investing. This is just getting a free ride. And they did not lend for the length of the investment. They just lent for 1 year, enough time to build it. So effectively, we had to buy the project back off them after they'd made their profit during construction. And they took no long-term lending risk. For our projects in Vanuatu and Indonesia, we've had the Asian Development Bank come over to Sumba Island and have a look at projects there. We've served 10,000 households in 3 countries in 300 villages. And there's been zero follow-on from that initial $5 million of public sector capital. And during the coronavirus period, all of those projects collapsed and died. So this is my experience of trying to bring innovative new technologies to replace manual processing, saving hours and hours of manual labor for women, displacing diesel mills and water pumps and things like that. And it reminds me of the early days of white LED lighting. I started that around 2000 with Light Up the World Foundation in Nepal. It wasn't until 2008 when we saw real commercial activity. And I literally got laughed at when I was putting around a business plan saying we can get 1 million people solar lighting in 5 years, which we went ahead and did. But it was a joke for a good number of those years until it wasn't. And it started to become reality. I've been doing solar milling now for 7 years, even longer. And we haven't even got out of the starting gates. In parallel, the Chinese have put in $200 million into solar mills in Zambia alone. So ours is the second biggest solar milling program in the world at 5 million, $195 million behind the Chinese. By the time we wake up to some of these opportunities, others may have come through and picked them all up.
Can I ask you to kind of wrap up, Stuart?
No, that's about all I had to say.
Anyway, you said you were really very candid about things. I think this is very interesting. I take, and I after the last intervention, maybe we will have time for response from some of the colleagues who might want to reply to the challenges that you mentioned. But I take as one message is that it might already be difficult to get public money, but if you want to make it viable, you need to make it commercial, and we also heard it from others. But once the grant dries up, there's a bit of a challenge to have the private sector take over from your experience for different reasons. I mean, I don't want to go into the details, you know them better than, and others are more qualified than me in the panel to answer that. But I would like now to move to the last panelists before we open the discussion and maybe some interaction between the panelists. And our last panelist is Wim van Ness, who is the Global Technical Advisor for Energy in SNV Netherlands. And Wim, we want to take advantage that SNV is on the panel because SNV is probably, I mean, one of the biggest development organizations concerning experience on the field, on the ground experience on biogas, if not the biggest one. And, you know, biogas is often hyped as a win-win solution. You know, you take the rubbish, you process it, you produce energy, and you even have byproduct which can fertilize the soil. So normally it should be easy to finance. I mean, it ticks all important boxes. We would like to hear from you, from SNV experience, some of the challenges and also some good aspects and opportunities in financing, in finding money to fund biogas, which seems so nice, at least on paper, in terms of finding opportunities. Floor is yours, Wim. You're muted. You're muted, Wim. We don't hear you. Hello? Wim, are you unmuted?
Can you hear me?
No, I think his microphone's just not working. He's not muted.
We can hear now, I think.
You can hear it very low.
Okay, all right.
No, that's fine now. That's fine.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Let me take off my headphones. So I'm just shouting in the computer.
Yeah, no, like me.
Yeah. First of all, congrats to FAO and IRENA on the launch of the report. I think it's maybe a very useful report. We'll definitely use that internally and externally in our operations. I'm sitting here on behalf of SNV. We are working in 3 sectors, agricultural, water, energy. And my input is indeed now on biodigesters. It's more than biogas, Oliver. It's biodigesters are not about biogas only, but it's about bioslurry. It's not a byproduct. It's equally important. And just to set the scene very quickly for the audience, I'm talking about household biodigesters now. Let's say we have an average size of 6 cubic meter, an investment cost of roughly speaking $650 US. Lifetime, if well constructed, 10, 15 years can go. Energy output is limited. It's between 1 and 5 cubic meter biogas a day. But we have also 80 kilograms of bioslurry with a dry matter of, let's say, between 6 and 10%. A potent organic fertilizer, so to speak. Now, I think there are quite a number of benefits associated to the technology, and you highlighted to that as well. But let me start with access to finance being one of really the main barriers to development of the markets. And there are two parties, right? It's the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, an investment of $650 for a farmer is quite a bit of thing. Of course, there is willingness to pay, but there is also ability to pay. What we've seen over the last 30 years, and we've supported the installation of over 940,000 units in 24 countries, so we have quite a bit of experience base. What we've seen is that on end user financing, the role of the MFIs is really disappointing. Likely because of the low investment, but also because of rural areas. I think that is why they focus better on urban investments or lending. So we see largely cash financing by the farmers themselves. So informally, they are managing, let's say, to raise the capital. Or increasingly, we see now also by a handful of companies only, we see a kind of supplier's credit. And that can go in various instruments. It can go lease to own, but basically it would say, let's say, repay the investment in a period of 24 to 36 months. But there are only a handful, and then also international companies only doing that. It's not more than 5, absolutely not. So very limited. One Mexico-based, one, let's say, Australia-based, and then the third one is maybe Israel-based, just to mention a few. For local biodigester companies and enterprises, it's really, really difficult to raise money. I think the way Stuart was highlighting, high interest rate, short-term loans, debts, but very difficult. So I think that is more on the demand side. On the supply side, partly already said, but we see that these companies are able somehow to raise capital from impact investors. And we don't talk small amounts. We talk about 5 to 10 millions in equity or in debt. So they are able, but again, very limited in the market, I would say. So access to financing will remain an issue for the coming years and has to be tackled. We raised also the question of carbon finance, and just to give that picture, and then I conclude my input. If we talk about an investment of $650 US, and we assume, let's say, a digester reducing carbon emissions by 3 to 6 tons of carbon dioxide a year, and the current price is between $2 and $10 US. This can provide quite some interesting annual revenues. So there are manners to generate that money. Question is how that money will be used. Will it be used by the private sector? And who is the rightful owner of the carbon revenues? Is that the investor, maybe the customer, or can it be used by the private sector? Let me stop here, Oliver, and back to you.
Thank you very much. Again, it's great to have people talking from their vast experience, and you touched on one aspect which the others had not, and I had asked you to do that, and it's the whole issue of carbon financing, which, you know, is also again hyped as great thing, but as you said, there are some kind of maybe governance aspects about it. From a financial point of view, it may make sense, but how to use the money and who will own the revenues is another thing. I intended to come up with a second round of questions to all the panelists, but in the interest of interaction, I would leave maybe my question to the very end. But I would like first to give the different panelists the opportunity maybe to address some of the others issues and maybe come up with answers, but also to give the audience the opportunity to interact. And I leave it to Divya maybe to tell them how to interact. I guess they can raise their hand, they can interact the usual way. Anyway, Divya, over to you for kind of, or you want me to moderate also the discussion?
Yeah, you can. Audience, if you have any questions, you can please include it in the Q&A box down under. And Olivier, you can moderate the discussion. I see Wim already has his hands up.
Okay. So Wim, you wanted to add something. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, maybe for this part of the panel discussion, I think very good to say that there is increasing interest for the renewable energy agri-nexus. I think we see that in our portfolio, Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, other donors increasingly pay, let's say, for projects focusing that area. I think that that's a good development. But I also would say that we need to think further, more thinking about systems change kind of making. My proposal would be to propose to donors to make all projects financed by development finance fossil energy free, maybe after 2025. I think it just makes no sense to continue starting using fossil energy for development projects. Let's stop that. And that automatically will, let's say, then bring opportunities for renewable energy in this kind of projects. And also let's think about market-based instruments. Let's say, I think carbon taxes automatically will also increase the demand for renewable energy related applications in the agricultural scene. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart, you wanted to intervene. Please go ahead. Stuart?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to mention on the idea of moving the industry along. Carbon credits is an exciting opportunity. Results-based financing often comes up as a way of subsidizing these sorts of systems, but in our experience, we've had 0 out of 2 good experiences with RBF. In the first instance, 2 hurricanes hit our project in Honduras, and we needed time for the farmers to recover and to have a crop to mill. The program refused, and so the 50% subsidy that we thought was going to come and could have come had they been more patient never came, and we lost a great deal of money. So RBF is great when things work well, but those hurricanes were not our fault. We didn't make them. So why do we suffer? We really need truly patient capital. These 2 and 3 and 4 year timeframes are not sufficient to build 10-year infrastructure. We need to start extending our timelines more and thinking more about risk guarantees. Another results-based subsidy in Vanuatu, we had to sue the World Bank partner in the Supreme Court of Vanuatu to get paid the subsidy that they were unfairly withholding, and we won. And we're still waiting for the money. And they had many, many opportunities to pay and avoid this kind of situation. It's really hard enough to do this kind of work without these RBF subsidies first distorting the market, so you can't participate if you're not part of it, and then not paying when you actually deliver the goods, or not being patient enough to allow the results to come through. So alternatives to RBF are also important, such as risk guarantee safety nets.
Right, point taken. Any other intervention from the panelists and also from the audience, please?
Okay.
Yes, Romeo, go ahead.
I sort of commiserate with the unfortunate realities that Stuart had highlighted. We do have a share of some elephant projects to a certain extent, not necessarily related to energy, but community projects that in the past were funded by government and some by multilateral agencies. That really showed the lack of determination from the start in terms of sustainability and ownership of the communities of such projects. That's why the design right now for the IPUR project, first is the identification of location, the beneficiaries, and the viability of the area, taking into account what could go wrong in these areas given external factors such as weather phenomena and several others. peace and order situation of sort, things like that. In the case of where we are doing right now, this community level renewable energy linked to agri value chain projects, we're looking at not just implementing this because these are needed in the areas, but implementing this because these are targeted in specific viable areas. When you have locations where a block of ice is more expensive than a kilo of fish, then definitely that is already a way to go. Put forward such cold storage, cold chains, ice making solar powered facility. When we go to an area where solar powered irrigation can increase the yield 3 times from just rain fed, definitely it's a no-brainer for that to be already having the viability. When we penetrate a particular off-grid area where the yield of corn or yield of coffee grew by twice or 200% because of the availability of this particular setup or intervention linked to renewable energy, then immediately you see the commercial viability in the long run. So these are some of the basic considerations that from the start, even in the design, even the community preparation have to be worked out, because at the end of the day, we're not looking at expanding this by a grant or by subsidy, but integrating private sector and business-driven commercial dimension into the undertaking as these are being scaled up.
Thank you. Divyam, we are coming, I think, about 5 minutes to the end. So I know that there are some closing remarks. So I don't see anybody else willing to intervene. So
there is just one pending question in the chat. This is actually also goes back to Romeo's point about whether the panel thinks that national and regional governments can use public or local development banks to finance renewable energy projects by local farmers and agri enterprises, and if there are any possible examples around that.
Okay.
Thank you, Dian, and thank you for the question. In fact, I can cite one project which has just been completed this year. We put this together in partnership with the local government of a 4th class or 5th class municipality, lowest in the totem pole of the municipalities in Mindanao, yet was able to work out a 215 million pesos loan from the Development Bank of the Philippines for the implementation of 6 solar-powered irrigation projects. So again, this is a business case that a very low-class municipality receiving lower share in terms of internal revenue allotment, being able to take out loan from a development bank for the implementation of RE-linked agriculture viability project. So we have that business case being put forward.
Okay, so one example. So it means it is possible and it's happening. Good. Divyam, do you see any other question or hands raised?
No, I think
I'll just try to wrap up the panel if you allow me.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then we will go to the closing remarks. I'm very thankful to the panelists to being very open and really telling us things which we felt were based on true experience. Not always good, but we know that things are not always good. We need to talk about these challenges. I take it that there's a bit of an issue in terms of, there's a big issue in terms of risk taking. And very often the IFIs are not willing to take risks, whether they would accept, they want, or they wish that farmers and other users take the risk. I'll tell you one example from Brazil. I'm just taking off my hat of panelist and now as a resource person. There was a development bank in the Amazon who came up with a scheme to put oil palm trees above a new fruit tree for farmers, and they want to do that. The farmers didn't know the fruit tree. They knew it, but they didn't cultivate it. But they said, okay, let's go for that. But they didn't know about palm oil. They wanted to replace palm oil with banana trees to shade the fruit tree. The bank did not accept because it was not in their books. They didn't have the profile about that combination. And so they wanted the farmers to take 2 risks, a credit risk and also a crop risk. And so, of course, the farmers did not go for it. And I have a feeling that you have a bit of the same in the arena of renewable energy, food, constellation and area, where the risk should be taken by both parties, and we need to find ways of addressing the risks, but also for both parties, and they need to talk better on those terms between them. So the user side, the company side, and the IFIs. That's one thing. One thing that I also take is you need to give time, and that's part of the risk. I mean, farming is not just a technology issue. Food production is not a techie fix. Time, unpredictable aspects like climate events, you need to take that into account and give time to time for crops to give revenues, perennial crops to grow. All that needs to be taken into account. And this leads me to a key point, is that the energy people should talk to the ag people more. And that's not only at the government level, but also between the private sector. We had one panelist, I don't know, I think it was Margareta who mentioned about the appliances, about the scheme. Basically, you have energy suppliers who are now also funding the users in terms of appliances. So you are part of, okay, it creates a big dependence from the users, but it's part of the package. And this might be a way forward, you know, combining the funding of energy with the funding of the appliance. This could be one way, but basically risk-taking from both parties. Let's think about that and give time to time, and yeah, get out of your box. I mean, from the energy side and also from the ag side. With that, I'm finishing. Thank you again for your great interventions, and handing over to Divyam for the closing remarks. Thanks again.
Thanks, Olivier, for the excellent moderation and the discussion. There's still a lot of open questions, but I think this means that we will continue the conversation. I hand over to Ute for quick closing remarks, please.
Thanks, Divyam, and thanks, Olivier. This has been really interesting, I have to say, and I wish we had at least another half an hour, or that we even sat in a room together. It was great to hear. In a way, I know we often don't like to hear the negative side of things, but we need to be aware of what some of the bottlenecks are. So that was good to hear some of our speakers being quite candid. So just to quickly wrap up, I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists for participating in the discussion, as well as, of course, our FAO colleagues for the continuing collaboration, which, you know, I'm sure there'll be next steps after this one. And of course, the Asia Clean Energy Forum for giving us this opportunity and providing logistical support. I totally concur with Olivier. You know, we need to be out of our silos. I mean, most of us are real energy people at IRENA, but we're very committed to continue advancing the Nexus approach and work through partnerships that can break these sectoral silos. So working with our more agriculture-focused colleagues in the FAO, but also many others. So thank you all very much, and I'm glad we still got some audience right to the end. Please get in touch if you want to know anything else, and go to our website and the FAO's website, and you'll find plenty of material on these topics and our latest reports. Thank you very much. Bye.